The courtroom was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that crept through fabric and settled into bone. Wooden benches lined the room like silent witnesses, polished smooth by decades of waiting bodies. I could hear the shuffle of papers, the soft coughs, the low murmur of voices that dropped the moment I walked in. Every step I took echoed too loudly, as if the room wanted to remind me I was being watched. I took my seat without looking up. My husband leaned toward the woman beside him, his voice low but not low enough. "She's too weak to speak," he whispered, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Watch, she won't say a word." His mistress giggled, a soft, indulgent sound that carried farther than she intended. "Look at her," she said, not bothering to hide it. "Silent already." Someone a row behind them laughed under their breath. No one corrected them. No one looked at me with sympathy. To everyone in that room, my silence confirmed what they already believed. I didn't lift my head. I didn't tighten my jaw or clench my fists. I let my hands rest calmly in my lap, fingers folded, breathing slow and even. Inside, I wasn't frozen. I wasn't broken. I was choosing not to give them anything. At the front of the room, the judge opened the file. He didn't rush. He didn't skim. He read slowly, deliberately, turning pages with care, as if each one carried weight. The sound of paper sliding against paper filled the quiet, stretching it thin. Something in the air shifted, subtle at first, like the pressure change before a storm. Still, I didn't look up. They mistook my silence for surrender. This hearing was supposed to be simple. That's what everyone said. A clean ending to an inconvenient marriage. A procedural step toward restoring order to a life that no longer included me. They had already decided what I would lose and what they would keep. The house, the accounts, the future, even the story of who I was. Across the aisle, my husband sat with the relaxed posture of a man who believed the outcome was guaranteed. His shoulders were loose, his suit immaculate. He had practiced this confidence. Behind him, members of his family filled the benches, close enough to lend silent support. They didn't glare at me. They didn't need to. Their certainty was louder than any accusation. The woman beside him crossed her legs and leaned back, perfectly at ease, as if she belonged there more than I did. She had dressed carefully, professionally, as though this were her place to claim. No one questioned why she was there. No one asked what role she played. She existed now as part of the picture, and everyone accepted it. I was alone at my table. I could feel eyes on my back, waiting for me to crack, waiting for tears or anger or at least a protest. Silence made people uncomfortable. Silence invited interpretation. And they were interpreting it exactly the way I knew they would. Weak, cornered, finished. The judge paused, his finger holding a place on the page. He adjusted his glasses and glanced briefly around the room. Not at me, not at them, but at the space itself, as if taking inventory of the tension. When he looked back down, his expression remained unreadable. I noticed things no one else seemed to. The way the court clerk stopped typing. The way my husband's lawyer straightened, just a fraction. The way the laughter from moments earlier had vanished completely, replaced by a strained stillness. I kept my gaze lowered. This case would decide more than the legal end of my marriage. It would determine who controlled what came next, who had the authority to act, and who would be expected to disappear quietly. It would decide whether my years inside that family would be erased as easily as they planned. They believed I had come unprepared, that I had walked into this room alone because I had nothing to stand on. They saw no legal team at my side, no dramatic display of outrage, no last-minute objections. To them, I looked like a woman waiting to be told what was left for her. In truth, I was waiting for something else entirely. My husband shifted in his seat, leaning back, crossing his arms as if settling in for a formality. The woman beside him glanced at me again, her smile sharp and fleeting, already savoring the end. Behind them, someone whispered, confident enough to assume the judge wouldn't notice. I remained still. Silence has a way of making people careless. It convinces them they are unchallenged. It invites them to relax, to assume the fight is over. They stop guarding their expressions. They stop preparing for resistance. The judge turned another page. In that moment, as the room held its breath without realizing it, I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the point where everyone else stopped paying attention, and that was exactly what I needed. I wasn't always silent. Sitting there in that courtroom, watching my husband's confidence stretch comfortably across his face, I remembered exactly when I learned to be. Before him, before his family, before the careful way I learned to hold my tongue, I had a life that fit me. I had a voice that didn't hesitate. I worked in a field where decisions mattered, where my opinion carried weight because it was informed and earned. I paid my own bills, negotiated my own contracts, and walked into rooms without wondering how much space I was allowed to take. I wasn't reckless or loud. I was direct. I believed that clarity was kindness, and that speaking up saved time. If something felt wrong, I said so. If I disagreed, I explained why. It never occurred to me that this could be a liability. I met my husband at an event that revolved around influence rather than romance. It wasn't a candlelit dinner or a chance encounter. It was a gathering designed to impress, full of polished conversations and careful smiles. He moved through that room like someone who had always been expected to lead. People listened when he spoke, leaned in, adjusted their opinions to align with his. I noticed it, but it didn't intimidate me. At first, it intrigued me. He was attentive in the beginning, generous with praise, quick to frame our differences as strengths. When we disagreed, he smiled and said he appreciated my perspective. When I challenged an assumption, he called it refreshing. I believed him. I believed we were equals approaching life from different angles. The first time I met his family, I understood I was stepping into a system that already had rules I hadn't been taught. Their home was immaculate, their conversations layered with meaning. Nothing was said directly. Compliments carried conditions. Questions were really evaluations. They were polite to me, warm even, but curious in a way that felt measured. They wanted to know what I did, who I knew, how I might fit. Not emotionally, structurally. At dinner, conversations moved quickly, overlapping, decisions slipping into jokes and then solidifying before anyone had the chance to object. I followed along easily enough, adding comments where they made sense, laughing when appropriate. I wasn't trying to dominate the room. I was just being myself. That was when it happened. Someone made an offhand remark about a decision that affected us both, something I knew more about than anyone else at the table. Without thinking, I spoke up. I corrected the assumption, calmly, factually. The room didn't erupt. It didn't turn hostile. It went still. My husband intervened smoothly, finishing my thought with a gentler version that removed the edge. He thanked me with a squeeze of my hand, then redirected the conversation as if nothing unusual had occurred. Later, alone, he explained it to me like a lesson I hadn't known I needed. "You weren't wrong," he said. "It's just not always necessary to say everything out loud. Sometimes it's better to let things settle." His tone was kind, protective. He framed it as guidance, not criticism. I nodded, embarrassed without fully understanding why. I told myself it was a difference in family culture, something I could adapt to. The next time it happened, the correction came faster. The room didn't even pause. Someone else spoke over me, and my husband met my eyes briefly, a silent reminder. I stopped mid-sentence. That was the first time I felt the warmth return immediately. His family smiled again. The conversation flowed. Someone complimented my grace, my ability to read the room. I was praised for being easy, for understanding how things worked. Silence, I learned, was rewarded. It didn't happen all at once. It was subtle, cumulative. When I spoke less, I was included more. When I deferred, decisions felt smoother. When I let my husband speak for both of us, no one questioned my place. He began to frame it as support. "Let me handle this," he would say, resting a hand on my back. "You don't need to carry everything." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that partnership meant choosing which battles were worth fighting. His family reinforced it without ever saying so directly. They praised my calm. They admired my restraint. When I did speak up, they tilted their heads, concerned, as if I were overexerting myself emotionally. I started apologizing more. Not for being wrong, but for making things uncomfortable. Over time, I learned exactly when my voice caused friction. I learned when to smile instead of respond, when to let a comment pass unanswered. I told myself this was maturity, compromise, growth. What I didn't see yet was the role quietly forming around me. I was becoming the agreeable presence, the stabilizer, the one who absorbed tension so others didn't have to. My value wasn't in what I contributed, but in what I withheld. By the time I noticed how rarely anyone asked for my opinion, it felt too late to point it out. The expectation had already been set. I fit better now, they said. I had adjusted. Sitting in that courtroom years later, I understood the truth with a clarity that made my chest ache. Silence hadn't been something I did once. It had been something I practiced, refined, and eventually perfected because it kept the peace. What I didn't realize then was that peace came at a price. And by the time I understood what it cost, my silence was no longer a choice. It was something they counted on. After I learned when not to speak, I was shown where not to question. Money entered our marriage quietly, wrapped in the language of opportunity and foresight. There was no dramatic announcement, no sudden crisis. It arrived as a suggestion over dinner, a conversation framed as planning rather than risk. He talked about the future the way people do when they expect agreement, not debate. It was positioned as a smart move, strategic, something families like his did instinctively. A restructuring, a partnership, a way to simplify decision-making. He explained it with confidence, using words that sounded temporary and harmless, technical, administrative, just paperwork. I listened, nodded, asked a few surface questions. Each one was answered smoothly, patiently, as if I were being guided through something obvious. When I pressed a little further, he smiled and reminded me how complicated these things could get if people overthought them. The first documents appeared shortly after. They were already prepared when he brought them home, stacked neatly in a folder, corners aligned. He didn't hand them to me right away. He talked first, easing into the subject, reinforcing how much he valued my support. He reminded me that this was about us, about protecting what we were building together. When I finally opened the folder, the language was dense, formal, deliberately inaccessible. Paragraphs ran long, sentences folding back on themselves. I read slowly, tracing each line with my finger, feeling a familiar unease rise in my chest. He watched me with a patience that felt practiced. "There's no rush," he said, though the implication was clear. Everyone else had already agreed. This had been discussed. This was expected. I asked about a clause near the middle, one that seemed to change how decisions would be made. He leaned over, glanced at it briefly, then waved it off with a small laugh. "That's standard. It doesn't affect anything day to day." His family echoed him later casually when the topic came up in conversation. Someone mentioned how efficient the new structure would be, how it eliminated unnecessary friction. I noticed how easily they spoke about it, how little interest they showed in whether I fully understood. I felt the familiar choice settle in front of me. Speak up and slow everything down, risk appearing difficult, emotional, uncooperative. Or trust the man I loved and the family he came from. Believe that my hesitation was just unfamiliarity. I signed. The relief was immediate. Tension I hadn't realized was present dissolved from the room. My husband kissed my forehead, thanked me for being flexible, for seeing the bigger picture. His family's warmth returned, effortless and approving. Someone commented on how lucky he was to have such a supportive wife. I told myself this was partnership. This was adulthood. People made compromises all the time. For a while it seemed to pay off. I was included again, consulted on surface-level matters, praised for my understanding. The household moved smoothly, decisions made quickly, without the pauses and debates that had once slowed things down. But subtle shifts followed, so small I almost missed them. Information began arriving later than it used to, sometimes secondhand. Meetings happened without me, then were summarized afterward as if my presence would have been redundant. When I asked questions, the answers were shorter, less detailed. Language changed, too. What had once been ours became the company, the trust, the arrangement. Decisions were discussed as conclusions rather than conversations. I noticed my name appearing differently on correspondence, referenced indirectly, when it was referenced at all. At first, I assumed it was temporary. A phase. Growing pains. I reminded myself how often people warned against reading too much into logistics. His family remained involved, always present when these matters arose, reinforcing the narrative. This was how things were done. Outsiders didn't always understand the efficiency of it. They spoke as if I were still an outsider, despite my marriage, despite my signature on their documents. I began to sense that something had been shifted, quietly and permanently, but I couldn't yet name what it was. There was no single moment to point to, no argument to replay. Just a growing awareness that I was being informed rather than included. The strangest part was how reasonable it all seemed on the surface. No one raised their voice. No one dismissed me outright. Everything was framed as practical, necessary, inevitable. And because I had already learned the value of silence, because I had already been rewarded for not disrupting the system, I hesitated to challenge it. I told myself this wasn't loss, it was structure. But late at night, when the house was quiet and I replayed conversations in my head, I felt the weight of that signature pressing against my chest. I thought about the clause I had questioned and then dismissed. I wondered what else I hadn't fully read. That document wasn't the last thing I signed. It was the first. And without realizing it, I had agreed not just to a financial arrangement, but to a version of myself that existed on the margins of decisions that would one day decide my fate. After the first document, nothing dramatic happened, and that was what made the habit stick. Life continued with a polished ease that suggested everything was fine. Dinners were still hosted, conversations still flowed, laughter still surfaced at the right moments. On the surface, I was part of it all. Beneath that surface, something subtle had shifted, like a current changing direction without disturbing the water above. Family gatherings became exercises in observation. Decisions were made in passing, folded into jokes or comments that sounded casual until they weren't. Plans were announced rather than discussed. I learned to recognize the rhythm of it, the way conversations accelerated just enough to leave no space for interruption. When I spoke, people listened politely. When I stayed quiet, they relaxed. I adjusted without consciously deciding to. I waited an extra beat before responding, gauged the room before offering an opinion. I smiled through comments that brushed too close to discomfort. When I chose silence, it was met with approval so immediate it felt like relief. "You're so good at keeping things calm," someone said once, touching my arm as if it were a compliment that required physical emphasis. That was around the time she began appearing more often. She was introduced as a professional asset, someone who understood the complexities of the world my husband and his family operated in. Smart, efficient, always prepared. Her presence was explained as practical, necessary even, and no one questioned it. From the beginning, she spoke freely. She asked questions I no longer did, offered opinions without hesitation. When she talked, the room leaned toward her. When she suggested something, it was considered. I noticed the contrast immediately. She knew details I hadn't been told yet. She referenced conversations I hadn't been part of. When decisions were summarized, they came from her mouth, not mine. Once, she finished a sentence I had started in my head but never voiced, and everyone nodded as if she had articulated something essential. No one noticed that I hadn't spoken. The first time my silence was expected rather than chosen, it caught me off guard. It was a decision that affected me directly, something that would alter my day-to-day life in ways I couldn't ignore. I waited for the moment when someone would ask my opinion, or at least check for my agreement. It never came. I opened my mouth, ready to insert myself into a conversation that was clearly moving on without me, and my husband gently placed a hand on my knee under the table. He didn't look at me. He simply continued speaking, redirecting the discussion with practiced ease. Later, in private, he framed it as consideration. "That wasn't the right setting," he said. "We can talk about it later." The later never came. Language became the most effective tool they used. No one told me to stop talking. They just made speaking feel unnecessary, even inconvenient. When I expressed confusion, I was told I was overthinking. When I expressed discomfort, I was reassured it wasn't personal. "It's just how things work," my husband said more than once. "You don't need to take everything so seriously." The family echoed him without coordination, each phrase reinforcing the last. They thanked me for handling situations gracefully, for being understanding, for not complicating things. Every compliment carried a lesson. I learned that my silence made other people comfortable. I learned that comfort was valued more than clarity. The social consequences of speaking up became clearer over time. When I pushed back, invitations cooled, conversations shortened, eye contact drifted elsewhere. When I stayed quiet, warmth returned just as quickly, as if nothing had ever been wrong. I began to bargain with myself. This is easier, I thought. This keeps the peace. I told myself that compromise was the foundation of marriage, that not every thought needed to be shared, that maturity meant restraint. I watched myself disappear in small increments, telling myself it was temporary. What I didn't recognize yet was the role quietly solidifying around me. I was no longer a participant. I was a stabilizer. The presence that absorbed tension so others didn't have to. My value wasn't in my ideas or objections, but in my ability to make the system run smoothly by not disrupting it. Silence wasn't just something I did anymore. It was something they relied on. The more predictable I became, the more they assumed. My quiet was interpreted as agreement, my lack of objection as consent. Decisions affecting my future were made with the confidence of people who believed resistance had been trained out of me, and in many ways, it had. There were moments, late at night, when the weight of it pressed in unexpectedly. I would replay conversations and realize how often I had been present without being consulted, how easily my absence from decisions had become routine. But by then, breaking the habit felt dangerous. Speaking up would disrupt a balance that everyone else seemed invested in maintaining. Silence felt safer, even as it cost me something I couldn't yet fully name. By the time I understood that my quiet had become an expectation, not a courtesy, the system was already built around it. They didn't just prefer my silence. They counted on it. And soon they would mistake it for permission. By then, my quiet presence was no longer noticed. It was assumed. The betrayal didn't arrive with a confrontation or a dramatic reveal. It unfolded in a room full of people who already knew. A formal gathering hosted by his family, polished and controlled, where everyone understood their role. I understood mine the moment I walked in. She was there before I was announced, not standing off to the side, not lingering awkwardly. She was positioned beside him, close enough that no one questioned it. Her hand rested lightly on the back of his chair, familiar, proprietary. When people greeted them, they didn't hesitate. They didn't correct themselves. They spoke as if this configuration had existed for some time. I felt it then, a slow, sinking recognition that this wasn't new. Conversations flowed around me, not through me. I caught fragments as I moved through the room, references to plans and timelines that no one bothered to explain. Someone asked her opinion about an upcoming decision, and she answered without glancing in my direction. No one looked to me for confirmation. It wasn't whispered. It wasn't hidden. It was simply accepted. I stood there, a glass untouched in my hand, watching the final layer of denial peel away. This wasn't an affair in the way I had once imagined. It was an arrangement, one that had already been integrated into the structure of his life, with the quiet approval of the people who mattered most to him. The family's role became clear in small, devastating ways. They addressed her comfortably, looping her into conversations that had once been reserved for spouses. They spoke to her about the future without hesitation. When someone mentioned something that affected me directly, they did it in the abstract, as if I were a concept rather than a person standing 3 feet away. No one apologized. No one explained. The expectation hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. I was meant to absorb this without reaction, to accept it with the same composure I had been praised for cultivating. Later, when I finally had a moment alone with my husband, I asked him a single question. I kept my voice level. I chose my words carefully, the way I had learned to do. "How long has this been happening?" He didn't deny it. He didn't look ashamed. He sighed, as if I were bringing up something inconvenient rather than devastating. "It's complicated," he said. "This isn't the right time to get into it." I pressed, just slightly. I told him I deserved honesty. He reframed it instantly. "You're focusing on the wrong thing," he replied. "We have to think about stability, about what makes sense moving forward." My feelings were reduced to a distraction. My pain was an obstacle to efficiency. That was when the terms became clear. He didn't ask me to leave. He didn't say the marriage was over. Instead, he outlined what he expected. Composure, discretion, no scenes, no public discomfort. He spoke as if he were offering me something generous, something reasonable. "If we handle this calmly," he said, "everyone benefits." The implication was unmistakable. Security in exchange for silence. Stability in exchange for dignity. His family reinforced it without a word. Their approval was quiet, but absolute. They spoke in practical language, discussing logistics instead of morality. They treated the situation as a transition that required cooperation, not accountability. I realized then that the betrayal wasn't personal to them. It was procedural. Standing there, listening to plans being made around me, something shifted inside. The hurt didn't disappear, but it hardened, sharpening into clarity. This wasn't about love or desire. It was about continuity, about preserving a system that didn't have room for disruption. My silence stopped being confusion. It became observation. I noticed how carefully she avoided certain topics, how she deferred on matters she didn't fully understand, how confident she was where she shouldn't have been. I saw the limits of her access, the edges of her authority. When an option was finally presented to me, it was framed as kindness. A path forward. A way to avoid unnecessary conflict. Time-limited, of course. Lawyers were mentioned casually, as if they were an inevitability rather than a threat. Consequences were implied without being named. I didn't accept it. I didn't refuse it. I listened. That unsettled him more than anger would have. He watched my face, searching for a reaction, a crack, something he could use to recalibrate his approach. I gave him nothing. In that moment, he believed my silence meant resignation. What he didn't understand was that I had finally seen the shape of the game. They weren't asking me to leave. They had been planning my exit long before I realized I was being replaced. This gathering, this public display, this controlled reveal, it was all designed to make my departure feel inevitable, even voluntary. I went home that night and sat alone in a house that no longer felt like mine, replaying every conversation with new understanding. The quiet pressed in, but it no longer felt empty. It felt charged. They thought they had reached the part where I would step aside gracefully, grateful for whatever scraps of dignity they allowed me to keep. They believed the hardest part was over. They were wrong. This wasn't the end of my role. It was the moment I stopped playing the one they had written for me. After the offer was made, nothing exploded. That was the most unsettling part. Instead of arguments or ultimatums, everything became efficient. Conversations shortened. Decisions were made elsewhere and delivered to me as conclusions. The house settled into a rhythm that no longer included my input, only my compliance. Meetings I used to attend simply disappeared from my calendar. When I asked about them, I was told they'd been handled. Information arrived late, filtered, summarized in a way that stripped it of context. I learned about choices that affected me through casual comments, as if they were afterthoughts rather than deliberate exclusions. Language shifted with surgical precision. "We'll take care of it," replaced, "We'll talk it through." "You don't need to worry about that," became the standard response. My involvement was no longer assumed, it was optional. The house began to change too. Small things at first. A room repurposed without discussion. Personal items moved to make space for something else. A sense that decisions were being made with a future in mind that no longer included me as a permanent fixture. She moved through the space with growing confidence. Not hesitantly, not apologetically. She made suggestions about arrangements, schedules, logistics. And those suggestions were followed. I realized one morning that I was navigating my own home, the way a guest would, careful not to disturb what had already been set in motion. The family treated it all like logistics. They spoke in neutral tones about timelines and transitions, careful to avoid emotional language. Everything was framed as practical, necessary, for the good of everyone involved. They discussed my life the way people discuss inventory, something to be managed efficiently, without waste or conflict. Once I overheard part of a conversation that stopped me cold. "She'll understand," someone said. "She always does." A timeline was referenced, a sequence of steps. I hadn't agreed to anything yet, but it didn't seem to matter. My consent was assumed because my resistance had never been tested. That was when the advice turned into a threat. My husband delivered it calmly, his voice measured, as if he were doing me a favor by being honest. He spoke about legal realities, about how things could get complicated if emotions interfered. He mentioned reputations, resources, leverage. "I'm trying to protect you," he said, "but you need to be realistic." The message was clear. Cooperation would be rewarded. Defiance would be costly. For a brief moment, fear flashed through me. Not panic, not hysteria. Just a cold awareness of how thoroughly he believed he had me cornered. Then something steadied. Fear receded, replaced by focus. I stopped reacting. That alone seemed to unsettle him. He watched more closely, tested my responses with casual comments meant to provoke reassurance or resistance. I offered neither. I stayed consistent, polite, unreadable. The more invisible I became, the more careless they grew. They spoke freely around me, assuming my presence no longer registered as a factor. I heard names repeated, dates mentioned, plans referenced without explanation. Patterns emerged if you paid attention, and I was paying very close attention. It was during this period that I reached out to someone they didn't realize I still had access to. The contact wasn't dramatic, no secret meeting in a shadowed room, just a message sent late one evening, framed as a question rather than a confession. Someone from outside the family system, someone who had seen how these structures operated before. They didn't react with shock. They didn't tell me I was imagining things. Instead, they asked careful questions. How were decisions finalized? Who had authority on paper? What agreements existed beneath the surface arrangements? Their calm confirmed what I had begun to suspect. There was more structure here than emotion, more mechanism than loyalty. I didn't make a plan yet. I didn't confront anyone or announce a change in strategy. I simply listened and learned. I absorbed information the way I had once absorbed expectations, quietly, patiently. At home, the pressure increased. My husband checked in more often, asking where I had been, who I had spoken to. The questions were framed as concern, but the intent was clear. He was verifying that I remained contained. The family watched too, subtle glances exchanged when I entered a room, conversations pausing for a fraction of a second too long. They were testing the boundaries of my silence, making sure it still belonged to them. It didn't. By then, I understood the door they planned to push me through. I understood how it was designed, who held the keys, and why they believed it would open easily. What they didn't realize was that I had learned how it worked from the inside. They thought I was waiting to be escorted out, grateful for whatever terms they decided were fair. In reality, I was mapping the structure that made their certainty possible. Silence had protected them for years, allowing them to operate without challenge, without scrutiny. Now that same silence was working differently. It was shielding me while they exposed themselves. They were preparing my exit with confidence and efficiency, convinced the process was already underway. I was preparing something else entirely, and they never noticed, because they had already decided I was finished. By the time they began setting timelines for my departure, I had already stopped reacting. Silence no longer came from shock or confusion. It came from calculation. I watched my husband move through the house with the certainty of a man who believed the end was scheduled, not negotiated. I watched his family speak around me, not to me, as if my presence had already become symbolic rather than real. They believed I was waiting to be pushed. I wasn't. The first shift happened quietly, inside my own head. I stopped asking why this was happening and started asking how decisions were made, how authority flowed, how outcomes were determined long before anyone pretended to discuss them. Once I asked the right questions, the pattern sharpened into focus. There was an advantage to being underestimated. People stopped editing themselves around me. Conversations continued when I entered a room, then only paused long enough to acknowledge me politely before resuming. Names came up casually, dates mentioned in passing, references made to meetings I wasn't meant to know about. They assumed I didn't understand the significance of what I was hearing. I understood more than they realized. I noticed how certain phrases repeated themselves, how decisions were always described as already finalized, how the same few individuals were referenced whenever something truly important was discussed. It wasn't random, it was procedural. One afternoon I heard a phrase that caught my attention. It was used lightly, almost jokingly, but it appeared again 2 days later in a different context, then again spoken by someone else. Each time it accompanied a decision that could not be challenged. I didn't react, I filed it away. That was when I realized there was a structure no one talked about directly, something formal enough to carry authority, but distant enough to feel abstract. It explained why some people spoke with certainty and others deferred without question. It explained why my objections, when I had still voiced them, had never reached the point of consideration. They weren't ignoring me, they were bypassing me. I reached out again to the person I had contacted earlier, careful not to reveal too much. I asked general questions, framed hypotheticals. I described scenarios without attaching names. They listened without interrupting. When they responded, it wasn't with sympathy. It was with recognition. There's usually a framework behind that kind of confidence, they said. People don't behave that way unless they believe the paperwork supports them. That was the first confirmation I wasn't imagining things. They explained how families like his insulated themselves, layers of agreements, voting rights that didn't align with appearances, authority that lived in documents rather than conversations. Power distributed in ways designed to remain invisible to those not meant to challenge it. I listened, heart steady, mind sharp. The realization didn't break me, it focused me. I wasn't powerless. I was simply excluded from the narrative they wanted me to believe. And exclusion, I was learning, was not the same as irrelevance. Knowing too much came with risk. I became careful in ways I hadn't been before. I kept my routine unchanged. I maintained the same tone, the same expressions. I didn't ask new questions at home. I didn't challenge inconsistencies when they appeared. I let them believe my quiet meant acceptance. They tested that assumption more than once. My husband asked casually whether I'd spoken to anyone about our situation. The question was wrapped in concern, but his eyes stayed on my face a beat too long. I shook my head and offered a non-committal response. The family did the same, in their own way. Conversations would pause when I entered, then resume once it was clear I wasn't listening closely. Someone would mention a name, then watch to see if I reacted. I didn't. The more consistent I remained, the more confident they became. Monitoring eased. Conversations grew looser again. They believed the threat of my resistance had passed. What they didn't understand was that silence, once chosen deliberately, creates space. Space to observe. Space to connect dots without interference. Space to prepare. Late at night, alone, I replayed what I had heard, aligning comments with timelines, references with outcomes. The picture that emerged was unmistakable. There was a mechanism behind everything that had happened to me, one they assumed I would never see because I was never meant to. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same silence they had cultivated, praised, and relied on was now shielding me. It allowed me to move unnoticed, to gather information without alerting anyone to my intent. It let them speak freely while I listened. I began to understand the full extent of their miscalculation. They believed silence meant weakness because it had always served them that way. They believed quiet people existed to be managed, not to manage themselves. They believed authority announced itself loudly. They were wrong. Silence doesn't erase power. It conceals it. By the time they congratulated themselves on how smoothly things were progressing, I had already identified the pressure points, not the emotional ones, the structural ones, the places where certainty depended on assumptions rather than facts. I still hadn't made a move. That wasn't the time yet. For now, silence was enough. It protected me while they exposed themselves piece by piece through their confidence. It gave me access they never questioned. It allowed me to see the system exactly as it was, not as they presented it. They thought they were weeks away from closing a chapter of their lives. In reality, they were walking straight into the moment where their certainty would be tested. And I was finally ready to let them believe I was exactly who they thought I was, until I wasn't. This was the phase where they stopped being careful. Their confidence had ripened into something almost lazy, the kind that comes from believing the outcome is locked in. I could feel it in the way conversations no longer lowered when I entered a room, in the way plans were referenced openly, without the courtesy of explanation. They had already decided I was finished. All that remained was the formality of making it official. The setting made that clear. It was a private gathering tied to the family's influence, the kind of event that existed behind closed doors and never appeared in photographs unless someone wanted it to. Long tables, measured lighting, names printed neatly on place cards, power arranged with intention. My name was there, technically, but not beside his. I was seated at the far end of the table, angled just enough to remind me that proximity mattered. He sat at the center, relaxed, engaged, while she took the seat that had once been mine without hesitation. When introductions were made, no one stumbled, no one corrected the picture. They presented it as inevitable. I watched people adjust instantly, shifting their attention toward her, responding to her cues. She spoke with authority that hadn't been earned, but no one challenged it. Her confidence filled the space where my absence should have been questioned. Laughter came easily that night. Not loud, not cruel on the surface. It was shared, knowing. The kind of laughter that communicates something without saying it out loud. I heard it ripple down the table when someone made a joke about wrapping things up soon, about transitions being smoother when everyone cooperated. I didn't laugh. I didn't object. I noticed the way my husband leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually, surveying the room like a man who believed his position was unassailable. He didn't look at me once during that exchange. He didn't need to. In his mind, I was already accounted for. They believed my silence meant agreement. It emboldened them. Explanations shortened. Courtesy evaporated. Decisions were referenced as fate's accomplice. Someone mentioned a date that hadn't been shared with me before, then laughed lightly when they realized I'd heard it. "Oh, right," they said, as if it were an oversight rather than a reveal. That was the slip. Not dramatic, not obvious. Just a small inconsistency between what I had been told privately and what they were now saying openly. A date that didn't align, a sequence that didn't make sense unless something had been finalized without my knowledge. I felt the shift immediately, sharp and clarifying. I didn't react. I didn't correct them. I didn't ask a single question. Instead, I watched the woman beside my husband overplay her role. She spoke too freely, assuming authority she didn't fully understand. She referenced documents without precision, hinted at outcomes without grasping the mechanisms behind them. At one point, she attempted to steer a conversation in a direction that made a family member hesitate, just briefly before recovering. It was enough. I saw the edge of her confidence fray for the first time. I saw the limits of her access, the places where she relied on assumption rather than fact. She was close to power, but not in possession of it. That night, when I finally excused myself, no one stopped me. No one asked if I was all right. They assumed I was retreating, licking my wounds, accepting what they believed was inevitable. In the privacy of my car, I sent a single message. It was short, neutral. It requested confirmation of something specific, framed as clarification rather than challenge. I didn't explain why I needed it. I didn't reveal what I suspected. The response came faster than I expected. It confirmed everything. I sat there for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, the engine still off. I felt no rush of triumph, no surge of anger, just a calm certainty settling into place. They were laughing because they thought the story was over. In reality, they had just handed me the missing piece. In the days that followed, their confidence continued to grow. They stopped monitoring me entirely. My husband spoke openly about logistics, assuming my compliance. The family moved forward as if resistance were no longer a possibility worth accounting for. They mistook my continued silence for exhaustion. What they didn't understand was that silence had allowed me to move first, quietly, without triggering their defenses. It had let me confirm timelines, cross-reference assumptions, and secure exactly what I needed without ever alerting them to the shift. By the time they realized something felt different, it would be too late to adjust. They believed they controlled the next step. They believed the court date would be a procedural inconvenience, a stage on which they would perform confidence and walk away intact. They believed the laughter of that night marked the beginning of the end for me. They never considered that laughter can be a tell. It reveals when people stop guarding themselves. And when they do, the balance changes. They thought I was disappearing. I was already preparing to walk into the one room where their certainty would be measured against facts instead of assumptions. And for the first time, I knew exactly how quiet I needed to be, to let them lose everything they thought they had secured. The court date arrived sooner than anyone bothered to warn me. It was treated like a formality, a necessary step to finalize what they believed had already been decided. My husband moved through the morning with efficient calm, dressed carefully, reviewing notes as if preparing for a meeting he expected to control. His family spoke in clipped, practical sentences, coordinating arrival times and seating like logistics, not lives. No one asked how I was feeling. I arrived alone. That was intentional, though they didn't know it. When I walked into the courthouse, I could feel the shift immediately, the subtle recalibration of attention as eyes tracked my movement. There were glances, quick assessments, and then the silent conclusion they all reached at once. She doesn't even have a lawyer. The satisfaction was almost visible. My husband's attorney arrived moments later, expensive suit, confident stride, greeting court staff by name. My husband followed close behind, his posture relaxed, his expression composed. She was with him, of course, hovering just close enough to be seen, not close enough to be questioned. They took their seats together. I took mine alone, a few feet away, hands folded, expression neutral. I could feel the whispers ripple behind me, not malicious, just certain. People always talk when they think the story is already written. Before the judge entered, the room buzzed with low conversation. Papers shuffled. Phones were silenced. I noticed how comfortably my husband leaned back in his chair, one ankle resting on his knee, already performing the role of the reasonable party. He glanced at me once briefly with something like pity. The judge entered, and the room rose in unison. As we sat, the proceedings began exactly as they expected. Technical language, formalities, the framing of our marriage as a contract that had simply reached its conclusion. My role was reduced to a name on a docket, a figure in a process that was meant to move quickly. Their attorney spoke first. He was smooth, practiced, efficient. He outlined the terms with the assurance of someone who believed objections were unlikely. He referred to agreements, structures, expectations. all presented as established facts. His tone suggested cooperation, fairness, inevitability. I listened without reacting. From the corner of my eye, I saw my husband nod along, occasionally murmuring agreement. He didn't look at me. There was no need. This wasn't a conversation in his mind. It was a presentation. When the judge asked if there were any immediate objections, the attorney answered before I could move. "No, Your Honor," he said confidently. "We're prepared to proceed." That was when the first crack appeared. The judge tilted his head slightly, scanning the documents in front of him. He asked a question that seemed innocuous on the surface, something about timing, about when certain decisions had been finalized. The attorney answered smoothly, but there was a pause before he did. Just a fraction of a second too long. I felt it like a change in air pressure. The judge nodded, then asked for a specific document to be included in the record. Not a new one. An existing one. One that hadn't been mentioned yet. My husband shifted in his seat. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. The confidence didn't vanish. It adjusted. His attorney reached for his folder, flipping pages with deliberate calm. He found the document, handed it over, still unbothered. The judge reviewed it quietly. The room waited. I remained still, eyes forward, breathing even. To anyone watching, I looked disengaged, resigned, perhaps overwhelmed by the process. That illusion worked exactly as intended. Silence in that room read as passivity. It always does. The judge looked up again, this time addressing my husband directly. He asked another question, slightly sharper, about authority, about who had the right to make certain decisions, and when. My husband opened his mouth to answer, then hesitated, deferring instinctively to his attorney. The attorney spoke, but this time his confidence had softened. His words were careful, precise, as if navigating unfamiliar ground. Behind them, I saw the woman beside my husband stiffen. She leaned forward, whispering something to him, her composure cracking just enough to draw a glance from the judge. "Ma'am," the judge said calmly, not unkindly, "you'll need to remain quiet." Her face flushed. She leaned back, chastened, suddenly aware of the boundaries she had misunderstood. I felt no satisfaction in that moment, only confirmation. The judge made a note, then asked for additional clarification. More papers were requested. More questions followed. The rhythm of the room had changed completely. What had been expected to move quickly was now deliberate, exacting. They had come prepared for efficiency. The court demanded accuracy. I said nothing. I didn't interrupt or object or volunteer information. I didn't need to. Every pause, every measured question from the bench did the work for me. Silence, once again, was doing exactly what it needed to do. I watched as my husband's certainty thinned, replaced by focus, then tension. His attorney recalculated in real time, adjusting his posture, choosing words more carefully. The ease was gone. By the time the judge announced a brief recess to review the materials more thoroughly, the outcome was no longer a foregone conclusion. As we stood, my husband finally looked at me. Really looked. There was confusion there. And something else, flickering beneath it. Doubt. They had come to court expecting a procedure. They were leaving the first hour realizing it was something else entirely. As the judge exited the room, I gathered my things calmly, not rushing, not lingering. I felt the weight of the moment settle, steady and undeniable. They still thought they had control. They didn't yet understand that the court had just taken it out of their hands. And this was only the beginning. The moment the judge asked for the file, the pace of the room changed. What had been moving briskly slowed to a deliberate crawl. Papers were passed forward, hands suddenly more careful, movements measured. The confidence that had filled the courtroom earlier didn't disappear, but it tightened, like a suit that no longer fit quite right. My husband's attorney accepted the folder with a practiced nod and placed it on the table as if it were nothing more than another procedural detail. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. To him, I was still the quiet variable, already accounted for. The judge opened the file. He didn't skim, he didn't jump ahead. He read the first page, then the second, then paused long enough to make the silence uncomfortable. The courtroom seemed to lean forward with him, every sound magnified in the absence of speech. "This document," he said at last, tapping the page lightly, "defines authority." The word landed heavier than any accusation. It wasn't an asset statement or a financial disclosure. It wasn't dramatic on its face. No bold headings or sensational language. It was a governance agreement, dry and exacting, written to determine who had decision-making power under specific circumstances. The kind of document people assumed worked quietly in the background, invisible until someone needed it. My husband shifted in his seat again. The judge read a clause aloud, his voice even, his tone neutral. He didn't rush through it or soften it. He let the language speak for itself. Authority was defined not by position or proximity, but by conditions. Conditions that had been triggered. Conditions that changed everything they believed they controlled. I watched the reactions instead of the pages. The attorney's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He adjusted his glasses, then leaned forward, ready to interject, but stopped himself when the judge continued reading. My husband's confidence faltered just enough to register, his eyes flicking briefly toward his family before returning to the bench. Behind him, the unity I had come to expect fractured. Someone leaned toward someone else, whispering urgently. Another family member frowned, clearly seeing this document for the first time. It became obvious in that moment that not everyone had been operating with the same information. Assumptions had replaced verification. The judge looked up. "It appears," he said calmly, "that several actions taken in anticipation of this proceeding may have exceeded the authority granted under this agreement." The words hung in the air. No one laughed now. No one shifted comfortably in their seat. The performance was over. The judge's tone didn't change, but the room belonged to him now. Interruptions were denied with a raised hand. Clarifications were demanded precisely. The structure my husband and his family had relied on for so long was being examined not as they presented it, but as it actually existed. I remained silent. From the outside, it probably looked like compliance. Like I was still the passive party, overwhelmed by legal complexity. But silence in that moment was essential. It prevented anyone from anticipating my position, from preparing a defense against it. It forced them to explain themselves fully, to speak into the gaps they had assumed were safe. The woman beside my husband shifted uncomfortably. She leaned forward once, opening her mouth as if to add something, to regain relevance, to assert control where she believed it belonged. The judge didn't raise his voice or show irritation. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "you are not a party to this matter. Please refrain from commenting." The effect was immediate. She leaned back, color rising in her face, suddenly very aware of the limits she had misunderstood. Her authority, such as it was, dissolved under the simple fact of irrelevance. In this room, proximity to power meant nothing without standing. The judge returned his attention to the file. More clauses were referenced, more questions asked. Each one peeled back another layer of assumption. The narrative they had built so carefully began to unravel, not through confrontation, but through exposure. The document didn't accuse them of wrongdoing. It revealed them. I watched my husband's posture change, his earlier ease replaced by something sharper, more defensive. He glanced at his attorney more often now, waiting for cues that no longer came easily. The certainty that had carried him into the courtroom was gone, replaced by calculation. And still, I said nothing. This was the moment silence mattered most. The judge closed the file gently and removed his glasses. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering just long enough to register the shift in power. "We will proceed carefully from here," he said. "Any further action will be evaluated in light of this agreement." He made notes, methodical and unhurried, then set the file aside. What had been expected to conclude efficiently now required scrutiny. What had been assumed secure was suddenly unstable. As the court prepared to move forward, I felt no rush of triumph. Only a steady confirmation that everything I had observed, everything I had pieced together quietly, was correct. They had built their certainty on the belief that control was synonymous with possession. They never bothered to examine the mechanism beneath it. Silence had allowed them to speak freely. It had allowed them to reveal exactly how little they had verified. By the time the judge announced that the matter would continue under revised consideration, the balance in the room had shifted completely. The laughter, the whispers, the confidence, all of it was gone. They still didn't fully understand what was happening. But they knew enough to be afraid. And for the first time since this began, my silence no longer looked like weakness. It looked like restraint. The room went quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like the air itself had been instructed to stop moving. No one shifted in their seat. No one whispered. Even the restless sounds that usually filled courtrooms vanished. The judge sat back, hands folded, eyes lowered to the documents in front of him, and for the first time that morning, no one seemed eager for him to speak. My husband stared straight ahead, jaw set, the muscles in his face working as if he were holding something back. The confidence he'd carried in with him had drained away, leaving behind a brittle focus that cracked every time the judge turned a page. The judge adjusted his glasses and spoke again, this time not reading directly, but explaining, in plain language. He summarized what the agreement actually meant, not the version that had been assumed, not the version that had been whispered at family dinners or implied in private conversations, the version that existed on paper, enforceable and exact. Authority had conditions. Conditions had been met. Decisions had been made by people who did not, in fact, have the right to make them. The shift was visible. My husband's attorney leaned in, scribbling notes, then stopped, realizing there was nothing to correct yet. One of the family members behind him frowned openly now, no longer bothering to hide their confusion. Another leaned closer, whispering urgently, their earlier certainty unraveling into quiet accusation. The judge paused mid-sentence. He looked up, scanning the room slowly, deliberately, as if taking stock of what everyone believed versus what was actually true. His gaze passed over my husband, his attorney, the family, and then rested on me. I didn't look away. For the first time, my silence felt loud. "The court takes note," the judge said, "that restraint should not be confused with consent." The words landed with unmistakable weight. He continued, explaining how silence, particularly in complex legal structures, could indicate deference, caution, or strategy. Not agreement, not waiver, not surrender. The assumptions made about my lack of objection were assumptions only, unsupported by fact. I felt something shift inside my chest, not explosive, not dramatic, just solid. This was the moment they finally understood they had misread me completely. The family's unity fractured further as the implications became unavoidable. Someone shook their head, barely perceptible. Someone else stared down at their hands, clearly realizing they hadn't been told everything. Loyalty, it turned out, depended on transparency, and transparency had been selective. The woman beside my husband tried again to reclaim space. She leaned forward, lips parted, frustration flashing across her face as if she could still insert herself into the narrative. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't even sound irritated. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "you have no standing in this matter. Please remain silent." There was no appeal in his tone, no room for argument. She sank back into her chair, exposed and suddenly very small, her earlier confidence evaporating under the simple fact that the law did not recognize her presence. My husband exhaled sharply, the sound escaping before he could stop it. The judge addressed him directly then, outlining the immediate consequences. Certain actions were suspended, certain assumptions were invalid. Control, as it had been exercised, was no longer recognized until proper authority could be established and reviewed. Each sentence stripped away another layer of certainty. I didn't smile, I didn't nod, I didn't react at all. Relief washed through me quietly, without celebration. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a correction, a recalibration of power back to where it belonged. The judge finished speaking and removed his glasses again, setting them carefully on the bench. "This matter," he said, "will proceed with a full reassessment of authority and decision-making rights. Until then, no further actions are to be taken without explicit court approval." He struck the gavel lightly. The sound echoed, final and unmistakable. As people began to move again, whispering now with urgency rather than confidence, I remained seated for a moment longer. I watched my husband stare at the table in front of him, his hands clenched, his expression unreadable. The man who had whispered that I was too weak to speak hadn't said a word since the judge began. Silence had found its way back to him. When I finally stood, the room felt different, smaller, more honest. The weight that had pressed against me for months had lifted, not because everything was resolved, but because the truth had been spoken in a language they couldn't ignore. As we filed out, my husband glanced at me again, searching my face for something. Anger, fear, vindication. I offered him none of it. What he saw instead was what I had always been capable of. Before the noise, before the conditioning, before the years of being told my quiet meant compliance, control, composure, certainty. The verdict hadn't been finalized. There were still proceedings ahead, still details to be worked through. But the story they had planned had already collapsed. Silence had spoken, and everyone in that room had heard it. I stepped out of the courtroom and let the door close behind me. The sound was soft, almost anticlimactic, but it marked a line I would never cross again. Inside, they were still rearranging themselves around a truth they hadn't expected to face. Outside, the air felt lighter, as if the weight I'd been carrying had finally been set down. There was no rush of celebration, no urge to call anyone or replay the moment. I stood there for a few seconds longer than necessary, grounding myself in the quiet. The silence that followed me now was different from the one that had trapped me before. This one belonged to me. My husband emerged a few minutes later, slower than usual. The man who once filled rooms with certainty now avoided eye contact, his shoulders tight, his expression stripped of its practiced confidence. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The court had done what arguments never could. His silence mirrored the one he had mocked. The woman who had sat so comfortably beside him stayed behind. I didn't look back to see her, but I didn't need to. Her power had always depended on proximity, on assumption, on being allowed to occupy space that wasn't hers. Without that, there was nothing left for her to stand on. The family filtered out next, fractured and subdued. They didn't speak to me. Some couldn't, others wouldn't. Their unity had depended on a shared belief that control was secure. Once that belief collapsed, so did the structure built around it. I didn't feel satisfaction watching it happen, just clarity. What I gained wasn't loud or visible. It didn't announce itself in numbers or declarations. It came in quieter forms, authority restored, decisions paused, futures no longer dictated without my consent. The system that had been used to erase me was now required to acknowledge me. Just as important was what I no longer needed. I didn't need approval. I didn't need explanations crafted to keep me manageable. I didn't need to prove that my silence had ever been anything other than a choice shaped by circumstance. For a long time, I believed finding my voice meant speaking louder. That strength required confrontation, insistence, noise. I understand now how narrow that definition was. Sometimes power doesn't raise its voice, sometimes it waits. In the weeks that followed, life didn't transform overnight. There were meetings, revisions, careful steps forward. Healing wasn't linear. There were moments of grief for the version of my life I had believed in, for the years spent shrinking myself to keep others comfortable. But there was also space to decide without asking permission, space to move through rooms without measuring my words, space to exist without being interpreted as a problem to solve. I reclaimed my home, not by changing everything at once, but by making small, deliberate choices that reflected me. I reclaimed my time by choosing where my attention went and where it didn't. I reclaimed my identity by remembering who I had been before silence was mistaken for weakness. The irony wasn't lost on me. The judge hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't scolded or lectured. He had simply read what was there and refused to accept the story built on assumption instead of fact. In doing so, he saw something others had missed for years. Silence is not absence. It is not agreement. It is not surrender. When chosen deliberately, silence is control. Looking back now, I don't regret the quiet. I regret only that I believed it defined me. That I allowed others to decide what it meant without ever asking. If you're listening to this, and you've ever been underestimated because you stayed calm, because you didn't argue, because you chose restraint over spectacle, I want you to hear this clearly. Your silence does not make you small. It makes you unreadable. And that can be a powerful place to stand. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to know why. Have you ever been judged for staying quiet? Have you ever watched people mistake your composure for weakness? Share your experience in the comments. You're not alone, and your story matters here. And if you want to hear more true stories about justice, family drama, and moments when the tables quietly turn, stay with this channel. Subscribe, come back, and be part of a space where silence is understood, not dismissed. They thought my silence meant the end. In truth, it was only the beginning.